So I was thrown into the deep end. A lot of my peers were probably 45, 50, even 60 years old, right? So I was basically put into society of older senior engineers as a young intern. And I just absorbed everything I possibly could. I think communication would probably be the biggest thing. So typically in a US-led company, you can voice up a lot of things and a lot of challenges. You may find in the Chinese culture that you are better to keep quiet and not voice them up. You know, you have things like face and respect and these kinds of things within your operating line. At the same time, you learn to work with others.
Chris is the Chief Digital Officer at Huawei International.
There's a lot of advancements to the Chinese tech now that is really putting that story to bed, right? Because it used to be like, oh, well, you could look through the source code and you'd find things. And now it's like, there's simply features and technology out there that is not even comparable on the West side, right? And the depth of portfolio. I'll quote Lawrence Wong, who basically said, why can't you have two best friends, right? So essentially to say that you can play well with both sides. You don't need to choose one or the other. And we have this dynamic developing, which is considered as East-West strategy, right? So organizations whereby, you know, if you're $1 billion+ in revenue, typically you'll be looking to specifically balance your tech stack around the East and West because you don't want to be locked into one, especially now that things might advance very quickly on one side or the other. And we're moving into this era of industrial AI or AI for specific business use cases. And that's where we're seeing a complete paradigm shift in AI is now very relevant and very specific to your business use case. It's no longer just like a chatbot that summarizes a document.
Hi guys, welcome back to the CTO show hosted by 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏. I'm your host Philip, and today we're in Singapore with another super interesting guest who is Chris. Welcome to the show, Chris.
Thank you, Philip.
Chris is the Chief Digital Officer at Huawei International. And Chris, you have such a multifaceted and very interesting career, ranging from bigger companies to small companies across the entire world. So let's start with that. Maybe what brought you to Huawei, and tell us a little bit more about your career as a whole.
Sure. So Huawei itself were pursuing me for maybe even close to 10 years.
Wow.
So at the time they first ever approached me, they were almost a non-player in data storage and kind of infra. They were very much upcoming, right? And then by the time they actually got my attention, which was probably somewhere around 2018, you know, they leapfrog ahead of where they were in the past, and we used to kind of laugh at them as a joke in the industry, and they were just like bleeding edge ahead of what, you know, a lot of other industry players were doing. So that certainly caught my interest.
Awesome. I mean, Huawei right now, I think, has a lot of different types of business units. I think a lot of consumers maybe in Asia are very familiar with more of the consumer-facing ones, but maybe do you mind just giving the audience a general sense of what Huawei does and, you know, what are the different business units that Huawei is involved in?
Sure. So there's multiple pillars to Huawei's business. We've got our consumer business, which is most well known, right? The handphone business and, you know, smart devices. And then you've got the carrier business, which is predominantly dealing with telecommunication companies, right? So you're dealing with companies around the 4G and 5G networks predominantly. You've got then our enterprise business, which is dealing with your typical, you know, Dell EMC and HP kind of equipment, right? So it's the networking, the storage, the compute for data center, even everything to the power and cooling for data centers, right? So that's probably a bread and butter of our business, which is enterprise and carrier business. And then we do a lot of new and interesting things, which are around, let's say, cloud. For example, Huawei has Huawei Public Cloud, right? So we have all cloud services, a lot of services equivalent of what you could get from the likes of AWS, etc. So we have a very broad portfolio. One of the things that differentiated us a bit there is that we have a lot of local presence in places like Indonesia, Philippines, and Thailand, right? So we had those data centers early on. And in terms of our real up-and-coming business, which is around the you know, EV, smart car industry, right? So a lot of Huawei battery tech and the Harmony OS around the actual systems. You could almost say that we have an aspiration to be the Bosch of China, right? So Bosch very big in the car parts industry. So we're also kind of providing blueprinting and everything around car design.
Wow. And Huawei is just not a Chinese company. You guys operate across the entire world, right?
Yeah, so Huawei is very international in its approach. We try to localize as much as possible in the countries that we operate by. And we also try to instill some of that R&D and, you know, high-end knowledge that comes from our HQ out into the field. So we have R&D engineers that are deployed out into the field to make sure that that knowledge is not just siloed. And at the same time, those engineers learn from the local kind of experiences and take that knowledge back to help innovate our products and make them better.
That's great. Well, I think before you weren't actually working with a lot of Chinese companies, right? So we'd love to learn a little bit more about your previous career and, you know, kind of what led you to Huawei? Yeah.
Sure. So, I mean, we can backtrack right to the beginning when I was in high school. I was building white box PCs, right? And I was selling those to, my teachers at school, selling those to my friends and family businesses of friends. And eventually I even landed a support contract with a large engineering company from Germany, offshore engineering company. So that kind of pursued me through my college years and eventually got caught between, ironically, we're in 𝗵𝗵𝗶𝘀𝗲𝗃 today, right? 𝗵𝗵𝗶𝘀. And, I was doing a lot of componentry sales, this kind of thing. And that wasn't really where the direction of the business should have been. It should have been around consulting in the small businesses I was working with. So I got a little bit lost maybe between where the business is going. I got, a shop that I tried to set up and then I kind of got diluted by that and ended up in an enterprise business with Hitachi Data Systems, right? Wow. So that was my big foray out of just doing some very basic SMB type consulting work into actual real big enterprise where I was working with some of the largest companies in Australia, doing some of the marketing things around the data systems. And then I got noticed for my technical acumen, right? So you noticed in our earlier discussions, we talked about my background being this mix of business and marketing. So tech was predominantly hands-on for me. Like I had hands-on experience right from a kid, building computers and getting hands-on. It wasn't something that I learned through education. I didn't go to university to learn. I didn't study computer science. It was all hands-on knowledge from my own passion. So you can then take that from the enterprise side. I got to deal with all these big companies, from banking, from mining, energy, and I learned a lot. Like coming from, so I was 21 years old at the time, right? So I was thrown into the deep end. A lot of my peers were probably 45, 50, even 60 years old, right? So I was basically put into a society of older senior engineers as a young intern. And I just absorbed everything I possibly could.
That's crazy. And your last role before Huawei was?
So before Huawei, I was with Red Hat CTO office.
Okay.
So predominantly driving a lot of things around their cloud platform, DevOps, and their storage platforms.
And Red Hat is a US firm, but they're they're very into open source, right?
Yes. So complete paradigm shift, right? From the Red Hat US westernized company, very open kind of communication model. Everyone has a political say in what goes on, to a Chinese company that's very hierarchical. Probably takes a little bit from the military kind of stance, and from that perspective, complete culture shift.
Yeah, I think a lot of the audience may be actually quite curious about what is it like to actually work for a Chinese company, because we often have a lot of guests, let's say from the US, from Meta, Google, these kind of companies, but not so many from a big Chinese company like Huawei. So yeah, we'd love some more insight about what life and working is like there.
Sure. So a lot of people may not last 6 months when it comes to the culture shift, right? There's a strong adaptation you have to go through. But if you make it through that first 6 months and you start to adapt, that's when you really see the different side of working in a Chinese company. So for example, you've got things like the culture that everyone's a bro, everyone's a brother, right? You're working with your brothers, and it really creates this kind of family culture that you feel close and you don't feel burdened by asking somebody for support or help. In a Western company, typically there's a bit of a hierarchical burden, like, oh, you can't ask the boss for that, or you can't do this. And they somewhat suppress your ability to then advance because you're not reliant on being able to get help from other people very easily. In our case, we can very easily get help and escalate to HQ when we need help as well, right? We don't need to worry about being kind of working in a little bubble. The other thing that you'll see is language barrier, right? So we've seen huge advancements in the use of AI for translation, both in our internal meetings, internal communications. So everything in Huawei is done through Huawei's own applications, all our own self-developed services, databases, everything is all Huawei, right?
Wow.
So when it comes to having an internal meeting, you can have instant real-time translation, be that audio or be that, audio text-to-speech kind of things. You can have all the instant messaging is translated into English or Bahasa Indonesia or whatever language the local person is operating in. So it makes us very international in terms of operation, and it's very seamless.
And you're saying that Huawei actually internally develops these tools themselves, and they don't use really third-party tools.
Correct. So you won't find any Slack or any other messaging products within Huawei. It's all Huawei's own developed internal products and software.
And do you think this is a very typical kind of Chinese culture, or is it like a Huawei specific thing because you guys have the resources to develop in-house?
For the larger ones, so for example, ByteDance have some equivalent internal communication tools and things that they've developed, but it's very specifically unique to Huawei in terms of the depth of products and depth of technology, like to have their own database that's in-house built, to have their own ERP systems, so completely replacing any foreign ERP systems, right? That was a project done some now close to 10 years ago.
Right. And when you first joined, I'm just curious, like, were there any specific like obstacles or cultural kind of nuances that you had to slowly learn to adopt, and how did you kind of go about that process?
So I think communication would probably be the biggest thing. So typically in a US-led company, you can voice up a lot of things and a lot of challenges. You may find in the Chinese culture that you are better to keep quiet and not voice them up. You know, you have things like face and respect and these kinds of things within your operating line. At the same time, you learn to work with others. So you learn to work with your team and you face challenges as a team. Maybe Western culture is more individual contributor focused. So the kind of culture within Huawei allows you to collaborate with your team much more. And that allows you then to address challenges without having it necessary to escalate up for help.
Interesting. So it's more like communicating first within the team.
Correct.
And making sure you can solve the problem before you tell your boss or you tell a superior.
Exactly.
I see. Anything else?
Anything else that's specific? So as a Westerner, probably one of the things I can step away from is a lot of internal politics. Right? So because of any internal politics will be handled in the Chinese communications. So having not been involved in that allows me to be laser focused on my actual role, serving the customer and making sure we're developing the long-term strategy for the customer.
Right. And are there a lot of other Westerners who are similar to you working for Huawei, or is this a relatively unique situation?
So it's quite unique. We have pockets of them. We have even a company called 𝗵𝗴𝗵𝗲 in the US, which is where we do some of our R&D work and work for the US side of the business. We've had pockets of them through our UK. We had our Australia operation, which was closed down somewhere around 2019 because of the political situation, right? And then we have a few foreigners working out of like Shenzhen office and things like that in China.
And do you feel relatively supported and you can grow your career within Huawei, even despite the fact that you are a foreigner?
Sure. So the opportunity that's been presented has been phenomenal in Huawei, right? It really empowers you to go out and drive things yourself, but you're not just driving them yourself, you're driving your team to achieve, right? So, you know, when I started, we were almost a non-player in data storage, for example, right? We set a strategy, a long-term strategy, and in the span of probably the last 4 to 5 years, we have been able to take it from being a nobody to being the #1 player in storage in almost every region we play in Southeast Asia.
Wow, that's really impressive. Yeah. And in terms of work culture, I mean, right now, I think there's a trope among Chinese companies, which is they call it 996, right? 996. You know, which is 9 a.m. to 6 a.m., 6 days a week. Sometimes I heard it's even more intense.
Correct.
Is that also true of Huawei or the Chinese companies that you've seen so far?
Yes, absolutely. ByteDance and Huawei probably have a very similar culture. It's a hard grind, but again, it's done with that brotherly love, right? You have the team kind of working together, grinding together. Yeah, you're not on your own. A lot of cases you see Western companies, maybe it's 1 or 2 people that stay back late. In our case, it might be the whole team.
Wow. Okay. So it really feels like a family, basically.
Yes, family business.
I see.
Definitely.
I see. Interesting. I guess if I'm a Westerner and I'm starting to work at maybe a Chinese company like Huawei, are there any other things that you think would be good to be cognizant of, or things to actually adapt in so that I can, you know, succeed in that local context?
I think adapt is the key word, right? You need to be open-minded and adaptive. If you come in with a fixed mindset, then you're simply not going to be able to adopt. You're going to be one of those people that comes in 3-6 months in the role and all of a sudden you just can't get with the culture and you're not going to fit. So you need to be very open-minded and respectful of the culture. But, you know, things will adapt around you and people will support you.
Okay. Yeah, no, that's really helpful and I think very insightful in terms of showing us like what it is actually like to work there, right?
Sure.
Yeah. I want to zoom out a little bit. I mean, I think Huawei has been at this focus of a lot of conversations, especially in the recent years, right? Recently, I think there's a lot of more, you know, de-escalation in terms of globalization. I think there's been some conversations about sensitive technology, especially in the age of AI. And I want you to maybe just give us a sense of the role that Huawei plays in this global supply chain and maybe some of the effects that some of these recent talks have been affecting the company.
Yeah, sure. So let's rewind to like 2018, right? That was around when the whole trade war with China started to kick off.
Yeah.
That was led predominantly by 5G technology, right? Because there was all these marketing premises of 5G technology is going to change the world. You're going to have, you know, things like autonomous remote surgeries been happening over 5G, you know, smart cities enabled with drone deliveries and all these premises around autonomous vehicles or robot taxis, and everything was based on the premise that 5G is going to change the world.
Yeah.
But here we are today. What changed, right? You might get faster download speeds on your phone, and that's about it, right? So a lot of that hype led then to this kind of, you know, arms race around the technology, right? US didn't own any 5G kind of patents or technology. It was predominantly held either by European companies, by Korean companies and by Chinese companies. So you had then a huge competition because the US didn't have a 𝗵𝗵𝗲𝗄𝗲 or control over that technology, right? With this kind of arms race around 5G. As we said, ultimately it didn't lead to anything. And now we've got the same kind of thing happening with AI, right? So it's another arms race to who's going to control the AI. And predominantly that's being controlled by the US side thus far. And then all of a sudden, HiFi comes out with its DeepSeek model, radically changes the entire kind of approach. It's more efficient in terms of what it can deliver, and it's kind of open sourced, which is ironic coming from a Chinese perspective. You'd think they'd be closed source, everything's within borders.
Right.
But it's taken this very much Red Hat type approach of let's open source it, let's get it to market, let other people play with it, let them ideate on it. And now you've got people like Alibaba that built the 𝗀𝗏 model, which is based on DeepSeek, but they've distilled it down and they've built their own kind of version of it, right? And now you're seeing that becoming a standard, and nobody now wants to go out and develop another large language model because the model itself is so good, you can just adapt it to your specific use case.
I'm curious, obviously Huawei started a little bit later in terms of its technological advantage compared to a lot of these US companies, right? Why do you think that Huawei is able to get such a global lead on, 5G technologies?
So one of the biggest things behind Huawei is our R&D team. We have around 200,000 employees. Of those 200,000 employees, over 100,000 are R&D engineers, right? So if you can imagine the scale, and in terms of investment, Huawei's typical spend is around 10 to 15% of our revenue in R&D. So if our revenue is, let's say, around 100 billion, then we're spending at least 10 to 15 billion back into R&D. By comparison, a typical US vendor like a Dell would probably be spending like 5%. And they also grow through acquisition of technology. They don't typically develop in-house. So they might have a startup out of Israel and they acquire them and they kind of try and blend it into their portfolio. Huawei's portfolio is completely organic. It's built from ground up with Huawei tech. It's not built from acquisition.
Got it. And I think a lot of maybe people from the US, they have this perception that, wow, Chinese company must be stealing all the technology from US companies.
Yes.
Is that true?
So the thing is that there's a lot of advancements to the Chinese tech now that is really putting that story to bed, right? Because it used to be like, oh, well, you could look through the source code and you'd find things. And now it's like, there's simply features and technology out there that is not even comparable on the West side, right? And the depth of portfolio, so the ability of Huawei to support, let's say, building a smart city from the ground up with the infrastructure level, from the digital twin aspect, pulling all the IoT sensor data, mapping out the city, and doing that end to end with only Huawei tech really makes things stand out in terms of what the capabilities of the company are versus a typical Western vendor, which is we'll give you the servers, we'll give you the compute, and then you kind of go out and you get a software partner and you get somebody else in for cameras. We really have that end-to-end portfolio to deliver the entire project.
Yeah, and it seems like actually a lot of this end-to-end solution isn't even available in the West, right? So it's hard to actually say that they would have stolen it.
Sure. So let's say take AI, for instance. Huawei have an end-to-end black box AI solution. So everything is in there from the compute, the storage, the network, the GPUs, and you can just go and deploy your large language model on top of it, right? Including the little agents to, deploy a chat agent right out of the box with no code. So to have that ability to just deploy a black box to the customer and let them get set up on premise with AI rather than having to run out of a cloud is a very unique position. And we can only do that because of the breadth of portfolio.
That's super interesting.
This episode is brought to you by TechVibe, your one-stop IT recruitment solution provider. We connect global companies with top tech talent across Southeast Asia. Whether you're looking for permanent hires, short-term contractors, or employer of record, EOR services, we've got you covered, especially in the IT and digital sectors. Thanks for tuning in. And now, enjoy the episode.
Speaking of AI, I just want to maybe also dive into how does Huawei play in the AI ecosystem? What does Huawei do? What components is Huawei actually involved in this infrastructure?
Okay, so Huawei have multiple facets. If we would actually layer it out, if we take it from the top level, let's say your overall frameworks. So we have our framework called 𝗵𝗶𝗶𝘀𝗲𝗄𝗏. 𝗵𝗶𝗶𝗀𝗶 is effectively what we use as our AI platform. We have a few large language models built around that called 𝗵𝗃𝗃. We also then have distilled models from DeepSeek, for example, right? The DeepSeek trend. And then we have quantization, which is basically taking a model, simplifying it down. It may not provide as much accuracy in its response, but it can run on much lower spec hardware. So that's what we also do. And then we provide a platform at a software level. So we have our platform, which would allow you to essentially run multiple large language models. You can then disperse that amongst a bunch of GPUs. And effectively, you can run multiple models very easily. And you could have multiple teams working across that. We have no-code tools which allow you to deploy chat agents and things or APIs very quickly. We have plugins, so you want to like take a text-based image and you want to OCR it to extract the text out of it. We can do all that with plugins, scrape websites, these kind of things. Everything is kind of sitting there as a platform you can build across. What else do we do in terms of AI? Well, of course, the whole info I mentioned, the black box, right? And then we work with a lot of ISV partners where they want specific solutions. And this is where things start to change now. Because AI was really just around like, oh, let's get a chatbot or let's get like, a content generation tool that summarizes a document, these kinds of things. We're moving out of that now, and we're moving into this era of industrial AI or AI for specific business use cases. And that's where we're seeing a complete paradigm shift. And AI is now very relevant and very specific to your business use case. It's no longer just like a chatbot that summarizes a document.
Wow. Okay. So you guys do basically full stack and tons of applications actually as well.
Yeah.
Interesting. I think a big topic of conversation, obviously, in the past 1 year was just Nvidia, right? And I think especially now, there's even more proposed legislation on restricting Nvidia GPUs being exported to China. Has that really affected Huawei at all? And if so, what's the impact so far?
So the irony to that is that originally we were a bit worried like, oh, okay, so we're not going to be able to play here and we couldn't get some of our service ship with Nvidia, so that would impact the customers we could serve. But again, to go back to our portfolio, we have such a breadth of service available. All we need to do is be able to swap out those Nvidia kind of dependencies with our own NPU chipsets, right? So we have a Ascend chipset, which is equivalent of Nvidia, probably somewhat lower spec. But again, to learn from DeepSeek, what's been able to happen with DeepSeek, who use Huawei's NPUs, is that for inference, which is where you go in and you put in a prompt in ChatGPT or DeepSeek, right? And it comes up with an answer. Inference is that process.
Yeah.
So for inference, they're using Huawei's Ascend chipsets. When it came to the training, they used NVIDIA, right? So original DeepSeek model was built on NVIDIA. But for the day-to-day inference, it's all built on our Ascend chipsets. So really what we'll ever see is the ability to look at what could be made more efficient, swap out the chipsets. And on top of that, we did things around algorithm kind of improvement. We did things around removing the framework from NVIDIA, replacing it with Huawei's own framework. We have the software framework as well, PyTorch, typically used in the US, right? We've got our own framework around PyTorch, which is built on Huawei's tech. So we swap out a few software libraries and we can translate around 80% of PyTorch code into Huawei's platform. So effectively, for every US tech, we have a East
equivalent
answer. Yeah.
Wow. And right now, like, how do the chips compare if you compare maybe against NVIDIA A100s or H100s? Like, what is Huawei's progress, or even the semiconductor industry in China in the East and West comparison? Like, how does that compare right now?
So you probably see a lot of things in the media coming out now that Huawei will be releasing NVIDIA compatible like H100 chipset, right? So that's game changing for us because it means that you're no longer reliant on one predominant US vendor, right? And there's a few other startups out of China as well that are coming out with chipsets that compete with NVIDIA. Jensen Huang has mentioned though himself that the game is no longer around training models, right? So people were all big on the, you need to buy thousands of GPUs. And now because of things like DeepSeek and the fact you can distill it and bring it down to smaller models, you don't need those training GPUs, the high end anymore. Actually, the market now is moving to the low end, right? So it's moving to the AI on chip for some of the kind of robotics that we have sitting around the lab today. Or it might be that, you want to get a desktop based AI chipset, these kind of things that do inference locally. So that'll be where the big kind of focus probably comes in the next 12 to 24 months. But as it is to say that, yes, we do have competing products coming for the high end for NVIDIA. And today we're probably around 80% of the performance of what NVIDIA is offering.
That's impressive. Yeah, it's a very fast trajectory that you guys have been able to catch up, basically. Yeah. And it's actually quite ironic whereby, a lot of maybe the intention of policymakers in the US was to hinder maybe the AI industry in China. Yet it does seem like Huawei was able to really accelerate their own progression and development and cover that gap that, maybe now NVIDIA cannot, export directly there.
So I think it's a bit of supply and demand, right? So if you try and stranglehold people with a monopoly to US technology, ultimately they will look for solutions and alternatives, right? So a lot of what happened is you increase the demand for the China tech. So it had the opposite effect of what was intended. So it also then makes them more incentivized to develop locally and quickly at a much faster pace. So ultimately what has happened is it's just lit the fire rather than actually putting the fire out.
And I'm curious, like, how do you see this impact in, right now we're in Singapore, right? Which is historically a nation that has played well with both sides, right? But also around Southeast Asia and ASEAN, which I think, sometimes they're one of the biggest allies of the US, but also one of the biggest trading partners of China. How does this actually play out in this geopolitical side?
So I'll quote Lawrence Wong, who basically said, why can't you have two best friends, right? So essentially to say that you can play well with both sides. You don't need to choose one or the other. And we have this dynamic developing, which is considered as East-West strategy, right? So organizations whereby, if you're $1 billion+ in revenue, typically you'll be looking to specifically balance your tech stack around the East and West because you don't want to be locked into one, especially now that things might advance very quickly on one side or the other, right?
Yeah.
So for governments even, they're looking at, well, they don't want to be locked into just the US tech stack because what happens if China leapfrogs ahead in one specific tech and then you're crawling to kind of catch up, right? So these organizations are looking at how they balance like 50-50 between those different tech stacks and making sure that they've got the best of both worlds available and they can not be left behind.
So if you have any advice for US lawmakers who obviously, the US senators and congressmen, they have the interests of the US at heart, right?
Sure.
What would you tell them about, especially about maybe this chip ecosystem?
So ultimately, you're not going to be able to stranglehold China by law and policy, right? There's enough demand out there globally that aligns with China because of trade or other reasons that it's not going to be something that you can just stranglehold with policy, right?
Yeah.
Policy, in fact, is probably going to spur people to, defy the law, defy the rules and try and get around it, right? Because that's what most people try and do with law, right? So typically what you will see happening is organizations that want better alternatives or more efficient alternatives. And of course, if they're available, they'll pursue those, right? The other thing is open source, like we talked about with DeepSeek, is dramatically going to change things. So open source cannot really be trade restricted, right? And I think, as a kind of globalization goes, open source is a way that we all collaborate across society, and probably focusing better on having an open source collaboration globally, not just China and the US, but globally, would help the whole world, right? It's not going to help just specifically China or the US. And you'll probably see more and more tech moving toward open source because it allows everyone to collaborate and ideate much faster. Then it's about how you build your unique value on top of that. So you can focus on your unique value. Even give 5G an example in Japan. They built one national network where the carriers, spliced up the network and shared it. Then it was up to them to figure out how they add their unique value on top to sell the service, right?
I see. Do you think that the world will move in that direction of more openness, more sharing, or maybe a little bit less in that direction?
So you have a lot of it happening, but then at the same time, you've got the monopolies that come in, the Googles, the Facebooks, the Meta and Microsoft, etc. They all try and monopolize the tech. But ultimately, that doesn't always work out, right? Because you're going to have open source, and typically open source has been clunky, right? It just never piles up to what the commercial competition can develop. But we're seeing definitely a shift away from that, and open source can leapfrog ahead. And in some cases, they're forced to adopt it anyway.
Got it. I think one of the other questions that maybe a lot of our viewers may have is that maybe they're from countries in Southeast Asia. And I think right now the narrative perhaps is like an East versus West war. It's like a two-party race, right? Sure. So maybe for those of people who are in countries like Vietnam or Indonesia or Thailand or even Singapore in some extent, how can they also partake in the benefits of this entire revolution?
So a lot of the Chinese tech companies, Huawei included, have programs to assist mostly in universities for internships and for training of the younger generation in the Chinese tech. Right? So there's investments being made to make sure that they can be, able to get into these programs and get educated on it, where it may be not so accessible as a community that you can find all this stuff around the Western stack online. Maybe not so much for the Chinese tech, but you can actually access it through university programs and other kind of things. We have even our 𝗵𝗂𝗏 program, which is helping basically VC fund and back some of the startup industry, right? So there's some ways that you can access it. And then in terms of your alignment, definitely you don't want to be pigeonholed into a US, certified centric kind of model. So a lot of banks, for instance, would typically be like Cisco certified engineers that align with the complete Western stack. However, what you're seeing in Southeast Asia is there's a huge shift to the China stack. And because of that shift to the China stack, you're going to want to make sure that you're skilled up in what's happening from the Chinese tech perspective, be that in Huawei, be that in some of the even open source that's coming out of China, databases and the AI tech, DeepSeek, for example. Completely different alignment to what a lot of people be like, well, I'm Cisco certified, so it'll be good for life, VMware certified. Well, now people are moving off VMware, right? They're looking for alternatives to Cisco. So, it's another wave in tech shift.
And if they actually want to, let's say, get more, plugged into the Chinese tech stack ecosystem, do you feel like they need to speak Chinese or really be, in that?
So definitely it would have been a problem in the past, but now with all the AI generated, kind of translation tools and things like that, it's very easy to access, you can easily translate. It's probably not going to show up in a lot of search results as it may for other things, but if you know what you're looking for, and also within communities like the Huawei community, you can find a lot of information, and we've got great support websites, these kind of things. So it's accessible. We also work very heavily with our organizations or even ISVs. So if they want to develop technology with Huawei, we can deploy a team of people to work basically for free with our ISVs, right? So we will invest in them rather than a lot of the US approach is like, you have to join our program, you have to make minimum commitments, and there's a lot of red tape around that kind of engagement. We really set our barriers quite low on that, and as a result, we can develop very quickly with a lot of ISVs that otherwise may not have the chance.
Interesting. I guess, when we zoom out a little bit, I'm sure when you were, prior to joining Huawei, you had a lot of different career opportunities and things that you could have done, right? And maybe by joining Huawei, it seems like you're almost making a bet about what the future might look like, right?
Sure.
Because you have a lot of experience working with like Red Hat, which is a US company with open source. I'm just curious, like, how do you actually perceive that maybe in 30 years or 50 years from now, what does the tech ecosystem look like? Is it going to be a duopoly of sorts, or what do things actually look like at that point?
So I think you're going to have the typical major player monopolistic kind of approach. The big difference is that will happen on the tech kind of infra cloud stack, which is kind of what we see today. You look at the US, you've got your AWS, right? Maybe your Google Cloud and maybe Microsoft Azure, right? There's the three big players. On the China side, you've got Alibaba, right? You've got Tencent and you've got Huawei. So if you look at those as the kind of monopolies, it's then what you build on top of it though. And it's going to be the build on top, which is going to be the differentiating factor for a lot of organizations, right? They choose to build on Huawei Cloud with some of the unique features of Huawei Cloud, or they choose to build on, the US side. There may be some differentiators that pigeonhole them to different regions, right? And then, we can kind of see where it goes from there. But in terms of projecting forward, portfolio will definitely be a huge thing, right? I mean, again, Huawei's portfolio to deliver an entire smart city. Then you think about how that affects the home. You got autonomous robots, these kind of things coming into it. You've got a really big picture you can work with there. If you're just doing a single kind of tech like GPU from Nvidia or server and storage, you're going to be very limited in terms of what you can deliver big picture vision-wise.
Wow. Okay. So if I'm a young engineer or I'm, maybe just starting out my tech career, where do you think I should invest my time, and where do you think actually will accrue the most value?
Sure. So if you're a young tech engineer, and we had this conversation earlier this morning, right? You'd probably want to make sure that as early on, in your career, well, not even your career, before you get to your career, in your schooling journey, you want to be doing problem solving. You want to be getting involved in projects, maybe proving yourself out in open source or just building something for fun of it, for passion, right?
Yeah.
And that will help you identify your passion too. So maybe you're passionate about e-commerce and you go and build something around e-commerce. Like there used to be like sniping plugins that you could get for eBay, right? These kind of things. It's just a passion project. Someone was kind of curiously interested, something that helped them, purchasing in terms of e-commerce wise. But that's a idea of a passion project that could help. Now, if you project forward further, you got, okay, well, where do you go? Mentorship, definitely. When you're young, I had the experience in Hitachi Data Systems when I was 21, right? Working with a lot of senior people, I just absorbed information from them. Sales, marketing, tech, there was so much that I learned in that position. Not closing yourself off, not trying to just get into a junior position where you're, working the cashier or something like that. You want to be in an environment where you can absorb and learn. And if you move forward from there, then having a senior mentor when you're later in your career, right, to help you then direct your career and direct your decisions can also be a great way, as a sounding board for challenges and projects.
And what about specific maybe industries or verticals or even technology stacks? Like, is there anything else that you kind of would encourage people to look into or focus more on as we kind of advance in the future?
I think it's hard to direct anyone specifically to one industry, right? Because if you said one industry, that may not be a passion.
Sure.
So you need to find your passion, and your passion probably aligns with whatever industry that you're going for. For example, if you were to take somebody that's very interested in maybe healthcare, or something to that degree, use Ping An Insurance as an example, right? Ping An Insurance was a company that predominantly focused around digital kind of platform for insurance. But they built that into an entire healthcare program, right? So it's now probably one of the most advanced healthcare programs in China. So you can get your, digital consultation. You can go to a digital vending machine that will dispense your medication anywhere, right? You can get your IoT kind of wrist or, ring or whatever device that you're wearing, watch, and it's going to transmit data back, and it's going to be in the platform for monitoring your vital signs and your long-term healthcare. So there's a lot of things that can be done that are outside the bubble. That also then brings insurance. Insurance, they will do things like baselining the cost of medicines and things across all the different hospitals to make sure that you as a payer, as an insurance payer, are going to get the best deal because they can lower the premiums. So there's so many things that can flow on from just a single interest of you're interested in healthcare. Healthcare becomes insurance. Insurance becomes then fintech. Like it just goes anywhere.
Interesting. I guess before we move on to the last section, I would love to hear if you have any suggestions or advice for those of, the audience who actually, maybe they want to learn more about China and what's happening in the tech ecosystem, even the work that Huawei is doing, but maybe historically it's a little bit more opaque, right?
Yes.
Or it's harder to do. How do they actually learn more about this kind of stuff?
So the best way to learn from Huawei's stance is to attend a lot of our conferences. We do a lot of conferences and industry events. Mobile World Congress is a big thing for us. So Mobile World Congress, typically in Barcelona, Spain, or somewhere like that, is a big event where a lot of the communications companies, cloud companies come together and share their latest and greatest tech for the future. So that is a conference to watch. But locally, all across the region for Asia Pacific, we run events specifically in each country that may be specific around a specific technology, around AI, around a specific industry, right? So there's a lot of knowledge in those events where there will be keynote speakers and other people from the industry. And that's a great way to access knowledge because a lot of what we do, we don't necessarily publish online. Yeah. I think it's part of the whole thing with the PR and the press and the US versus China. A lot of things are outspoken, like they may be in a westernized company. So really, the knowledge is held within, and it's only by attending those kind of trade shows and events that you could get access to it.
Completely makes sense. Chris, the last section that we like to do is a rapid fire kind of questions. So I'll just ask you some questions and just say whatever comes to your mind, okay? The first one is what's your favorite tech tool or AI tool that you've been using recently?
Ironically, I have to say DeepSeek because it has a bit of a China perspective built in, right? So when I go and I want to write something that's specific around Huawei or China, I find DeepSeek provides a little bit more kind of color to what I want to say than if I was to use, let's say, ChatGPT, for instance.
Got it. And have you or do you use some of the other models as well recently?
Yeah, so ChatGPT would be my go-to kind of day-to-day tool as like a personal kind of assistant, right? But DeepSeek, again, for the more business context around China. And DeepSeek, of course, coming out with reasoning as its kind of flagship kind of introduction, right? That was a game changer for me to actually see the process of thinking.
Yeah. How do you learn more about these AI tools or keep updated with AI?
So hands-on is always my best recommendation, right? You may not know anything about it. Just jump in there, experiment, try. If you try, fail, you'll learn quickly.
Got it. If you're not doing what you're doing now, what do you think you'll be spending your time on? So
I have a few passion projects of my own, right? So I've got a few projects where I've invested in the entire thing from ground up building the software, right? So, the back-end development, the front-end development, the branding and, everything around it. So passion projects probably keep me going. That's like, what keeps me up at night and keeps my kind of motivation and passion in the industry. So probably in the future, I will pursue some of those passion projects as a more serious venture.
Yeah. Another question is, right now I think you have a few kids, right? What advice would you tell your kids about, the way the world works or life or anything?
So one of the first things I try to instill in all my children, so they're like 6, 4, 3, and 2, right? So they're all very close together in age. Never give up. So there's been a few instances where we almost missed a flight or something like that. We missed the trains. We had to drive all the way from Gwangju, which is right down the bottom of South Korea, to Seoul or Incheon, right? And it's about a 3 to 4 hour journey. And probably there was like an hour gap between us missing the flight and not missing the flight because we missed the train. And the proof point to them was we just made it. We had a 30-minute buffer or something like that when we made it. And they were all upset, like, oh, we're not going to miss the flight. We're not going to get to Singapore, that kind of thing. And the point to them was that just don't give up. Just don't give up. You have to try. If you don't try, you won't know. And the other thing that is just problem solving. I want them to learn practically from experience. So from very young age, I've challenged my children with practical learning that they can get hands-on, they can fail, they can break stuff. One of the things that I first taught my daughter is, about road safety and about, not running into the road because you might become a pancake. And I demonstrated that by taking an egg and dropping it on the ground and showing her what would happen.
That is truly very practical. And the last question is, for what are you most grateful for in life?
For what am I most grateful? I think I have to say my parents. So having a great upbringing, having 4 children, cost of living crisis these days. I don't know how they did it, really. I don't know how they did it. I struggle with my first 2 children, let alone the last 2.
Yeah.
So I really don't know how they were able to provide well and, you know, make ends meet for us as kids and make sure we had the education that we deserve and the opportunities. My dad helped bootstrap my first company when I was 16, like by providing the funding for me to go out and buy equipment and then on-sell it. So, you know, the opportunities that my parents provided definitely helped me pursue my passion.
That's amazing. Chris, I know you're really busy, so really appreciate you taking time and joining us today. For those of the viewers who want to actually connect with you or learn more about Huawei, where can they find you?
LinkedIn will probably be the best way. So you can just search me, Chris Moore. I'll probably be the first link.
Okay, and we'll definitely put that link in the show notes.
No worries. Thanks.
All right, thank you so much for your time, Chris. Really appreciate it. And tune in for the next episode. Thank you so much.